All right, in today's explainer, we're going to try and make sense of the absolute flood of information that's coming out about the Israel-Hamas war. We'll use the source material itself to kind of navigate all the complex and, let's be honest, often conflicting stories to see if we can piece together a clearer picture. Okay, so the very first thing that hits you when you look at the sources is just the sheer volume. I mean, it's a 24/7 media cycle, right? You've got this constant barrage of live reports, which creates this feeling of immediacy, but it also makes it almost impossible to get your bearings and really grasp what's going on in the bigger picture. And yeah, right in the middle of that media storm, you get hit with these incredibly stark headlines. You see these powerful, devastating images of destruction. You hear about strikes. You hear about ceasefires being violated. It all just paints this picture of total chaos. Honestly, it often leaves you with way more questions than answers about what's really happening on the ground. So what we're going to do here is basically hit the pause button on that relentless news cycle. We're going to take all these little snapshots, these clippings from our sources, and organize them by theme. The idea is to see what larger stories, what distinct narratives start to emerge when you look at it all together. Okay, so first up, a war on many fronts. We're going to look at how these sources show a conflict that isn't just happening on one battlefield. It's really extending across the globe, in a military sense and a political one. So let's start where you'd expect, on the ground, with military operations and strategies. The sources give us a look at some of the tactical claims and assessments about what both sides are trying to do. Okay, so one big strategic point that keeps coming up in the sources, it's all about border control. This article right here, for example, argues that securing the borders with Jordan and the West Bank is absolutely crucial. The goal, it says, is to cut off weapon smuggling routes, and it even draws a parallel to how weapons supposedly got into Gaza through the Egyptian border before. And this is interesting. Here you can really see the conflicting stories about military strength literally side by side. On one hand, you have sources talking about these extensive IDF operations, targeting Hamas leadership, but then on the other hand, a different source questions what Hamas is actually capable of after the ceasefire. It suggests there's a big gap between how strong they might seem and how strong they really are. So if we dig a little deeper into that assessment of Hamas's power, one source gives this really fascinating breakdown. It says, yeah, they might have new recruits, but they're untrained. The real story, according to this source, is that they've lost a ton of experienced leaders, and their rocket arsenal has been hit hard. The bottom line, the claim is that they're, and I'm quoting here, 10 times weaker than before the war started. Something that comes up again and again in the military reports is tunnel warfare. It's a huge theme, and we see these incredibly specific accounts, like this one right here, detailing an operation to kill Hamas commander who was trying to escape through a tunnel. It really shows you just how granular and tactical the reporting on the ground conflict can get. All right, so moving away from the purely military side of things, the sources also shift our focus to the human cost, which is just deeply personal and tragic. This is where we look at the story of the hostages and the casualty figures. When you look at the hostage crisis through these sources, you start to piece together this really grim, fragmented timeline. You see these dates, November 5th, November 13th, December 2nd. Each one is another painful step in the slow, heartbreaking process of recovering the bodies of those who are taken. And then you see things like this. Behind all the formal news reports and the analysis, the sources capture these raw, desperate pleas. Bring them home now. A message like this just cuts right through everything else, the politics, the military strategy, and it shows you the pure, raw anguish and the incredible urgency that the families are feeling. Now, when it comes to the scale of the human cost, well, that's where you see a lot of intense debate and conflicting reports. To give you an example of the kind of claims that are out there, one source we looked at, from back on November 30th, puts forward this number, 70,000. That's the figure it claims for the death toll in Gaza at that point. It's a staggering number, and it really underscores the gravity of the situation. But it also shows just how difficult it is to verify any information in the middle of a war. Okay, so the war's impact doesn't just stay in the region, right? It ripples outwards. It becomes incredibly political and international, and the sources show us how it pulls in global powers and even sparks related events thousands of miles away. And you can see that human crisis intersecting directly with American politics. For instance, sources talk about families of former hostages traveling to Washington, D.C. to lobby Congress. They're putting their personal stories right at the center of the American political stage, a stage that, has long-standing established relationships in the region. And this is a clear sign that the conflict isn't contained to just two parties. You get reports like this one claiming that a senior leader from Hezbollah was eliminated. This is pretty direct evidence that there's a much wider strategic battlefield and that other powerful regional players are involved. And those reverberations, they really are global. I mean, look at this. Sources are connecting events happening as far away as the UK, like this arrest at the Manchester airport in connection with a terror plot, and linking it directly to the wider conflict. It just goes to show how these tensions can pop up literally thousands of miles from the epicenter. And that brings us to our final section, because the sources reveal there's another front in this war, a really critical one, the battle over information. This is a fight for the narrative, a fight over truth, and sometimes a fight over the very definition of what's true. And this image right here is such a stark example of that information war. You've got a report about civilian casualties, and it's literally stamped with fake news. It perfectly illustrates how even the most basic facts, things happening on the ground, are being fiercely contested. And it gets even more direct than that. Here we see an example of disinformation actually being debunked within the source material. There's this story about a fake Iranian film, and it's immediately flagged with big red letters saying this is false. It's like watching a real-time correction happen right in the middle of the information war. The information landscape even gets, well, speculative. Check out this document. It's pretty unusual. It's a hypothetical statement supposedly from a former US president, but it's dated for the future, for 2025, and it outlines a possible ceasefire. It's a really fascinating glimpse into the kinds of hopes and maybe even the fictions that are circulating about how this war might, one day, finally end. So when you step back and look at all these sources together, what do you see? You see a conflict that's fought with bullets, for sure, but it's also fought with ballots and bytes. It's defined by military operations, yes, but also by its profound human cost, its tangled political reach, and this absolutely relentless information war. And all of that leaves us with one really big fundamental question. When a war is being fought on so many different fronts at the same time, what does a path to lasting peace even begin to look like?